And now I'd like to hand things over to Dave Gallup. Dave Gallup is the General Manager for EMLab PK. Dave joined EMLab P&K in 1997 after 10 years of engineering and management in the automotive industry. He has positioned EMLab P&K as a leader in the IA/QA industry by recruiting and training the most experienced microbiologists, and by implementing quality control systems taking from the airbag sensor industry to ensure EMLab P&K consistently provides the highest quality and service. Dave holds 8 patents and received his BS in Engineering and Applied Science from the California Institute of Technology and a Master's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Stanford University. And with that, Dave, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Great, thanks, Martin. All right, so let's see if this works. Ta-da! All right, it does. I kicked this off with this slide because to me it kind of symbolizes the state of fungal interpretation, which meaning some people take it as very, very serious and other people much more casually. And in this, we will do surveys of, I'll show sets of data, and then we'll get the participants in this call to respond of how they would interpret the data, and then I will talk about how I would look at the data. And I think you will see, at least based on history, quite a wide variety in how people look at the data. And so I will share my opinion. It's just that, it's my opinion. And I hope that it'll cause you to think about things and will be useful and interesting, and let's get started. So we talked about this. This is our most common question, so you'll see this several times. But to get your certificate of attendance, take the survey within 24 hours, and then in 2 to 3 weeks, your certificate's ready. All right. So with the fungal data interpretation, the normal caveat, which is unless you're a medical doctor, unless you're trained in the field and have experience in the field, be careful interpreting fungal data with respect to health effects. So just because somebody has or does not have a set of data that shows high levels of fungal spores in their residence or workplace, be very careful saying, oh, this is or this is not causing the health symptoms that you are ascribing to or concerned about. Try to stick to interpreting, is there mold growth in the building, or is there evidence to support mold growth in the building, in which case you need to fix the water problem or remove the mold. That's very sound advice, very defensible advice. You know, is there evidence of building defects, or is there water intrusion problems? Those are all things that, you know, should be resolved. And this is not to overemphasize it, but we get subpoenaed for lab data probably once a week, right? So this is something that happens all the time, of these things going to court. And so it's not a theoretical or academic exercise. You could get called to court and asked to defend statements that you've made. And so just be very careful with it. Okay. Numerical guidelines. Some people will say, oh, there are no standards. That's not really true, right? There have been a lot of standards proposed over time, and by lot, probably north of 20, proposed over years. I would say it's safe to say there are no widely accepted standards. There are rules of thumb. We'll talk about those that many or most people apply. But there's nothing that's like scientifically backed. So the ACGH, for example, used to propose numerical guidelines, and then they published this book called Bioaerosols Assessment and Control, which for a while was considered kind of the Bible in the industry. And in that book, they actually took back their numerical guidelines, which leaves the question of why. You know, why aren't there like scientifically based, or why isn't there some standard people agree on? Well, if you were going to develop a numerical guideline that says if you're above X, then that's a problem, you would need the following at a minimum, right? So you would, A, need consensus on or a scientifically based sampling strategy. Right? That is going to be difficult to come up with because you probably know far better than I the variety of situations that you're going to encounter and coming up with kind of like, here's how you do it for all these situations would be difficult. Then you need agreement on the sampling instrument. And, excuse me, that will be tricky because there's a whole bunch of different ones. They all have pros and cons, and they're all going to have, you know, advocates and proponents. And they have different sampling efficacies or efficiencies. So, and then you'd need agreement on the analytical methods. And there's debate within the community about how to analyze different sample types. You would then need agreement on what health data. So if you have, you know, 400 of spore type X, what does that mean? Right? And that data just really does not exist for the majority of cases, right? So in some unusual to rare settings, such as operating theaters, then you're getting close to, hey, this spore type, you want less than X, you know, in the air. But for like homes, residences, offices, if you say, oh, you have 1,000 spores per cubic meter of spore type X, what does that mean for the health effect to person Y? That doesn't exist. And we're a long ways, if ever, from getting there. Right? And then you'd need some guideline to drop out of that. So if you say, hey, here's one path to a scientifically based, health-based standard, or health outcome-based standard, some more intelligent way of saying that, we're a long ways from getting there, right? So what do we do, right? Well, we can say, look, you don't want to have mold growth, active mold growth in a building, right? In most buildings, right? So I'm sure in all these, right? So I'm going to make these statements. They're going to sound categorical or all-inclusive, right? Please be aware, keep in mind that most of the time it's case by case, and we can probably find exceptions to most scenarios. So I'm trying to provide here, because we only have a couple hours, kind of the big picture. And then there's going to be case-by-case differences that you'd have to walk through, and that's the value of the people, you know, on this webinar, in the real world doing the hard work, right? It's easy to sit here and say, oh, here's what you do, right? In the real world, it's more difficult. Okay, so what do? We can say, look, you shouldn't have mold growth in the building for at least a couple of reasons. One is certain types of fungal growth can cause structural damage. Wood decay, fungi can obviously be a structural hazard. And many fungi are potent allergens, right? Alternaria is a potent allergen. And you don't want active growth of that, because if people are exposed to that over time and they are genetically disposed, they could then develop allergies. That's not an instant effect, but it can take effect over time, right? So people could, 1-2 years later, start coming down with allergies to the fungi they've been exposed to due to the indoor mold growth, right? So we can say, look, we don't want mold growth inside. Okay, now that's different than saying, hey, we don't want fungal spores inside. For most common buildings, again, setting aside clean rooms, operating theaters, et cetera, we're not going to say, hey, no mold spores, right? Because fungal spores are coming in from the outside. They're coming in through doors and windows on pets and backpacks and clothing and all sorts of stuff, right? So we can say, look, how can we construct evidence that there's not mold growth originating inside? How can we say, look, what's inside came from the outside, right? And that's the trick, right? And that's what we're going to spend part of the time doing today. Note, actually, as an aside, we're tackling in this webinar primarily, perhaps exclusively, air sampling data, right? Because that's, in general, the type of data that we get the most questions on. That's the, I think, on the harder end of the spectrum to interpret. So let's tackle the hard stuff. Let's deal with the things we get questions for. For surface samples, if you've taken a bulk sample or tape sample or swab sample of the surface to say, is this black mark, is this smear, is this smudge mold growth? That, if we analyze it by a particular method, That's very black and white. You will get a report from the lab saying, yes, this is mold growth, and it's these following mold types, right? Or no, it's not mold growth, in which case the interpretation is very straightforward. Yes, it's mold, no, it's not, right? There are surface sample analytical techniques for surface samples that there is, Marvin, do we have, I'm hearing hold music in the background.
Yeah, let me see what's, okay, there we go. Go ahead, Dave.
All right, great, thanks. So maybe that's a commentary on how interesting this is so far. So there are analytical techniques for surface samples that are harder to interpret, but we do not advocate those analytical techniques. So if you take surface samples and you're stuck going, what does this data mean, then call us up and talk with us, because there are analytical techniques for many surface samples for fungi where it's just the report says on the report it says mold growth, or there's other things there that basically mean not mold growth, in which case that's black and white. All right, so back to air samples, right? We're trying to say, hey, does this data suggest an indoor source of fungal spores? All right. We can say, look, if there's not mold growth inside, then what's inside should, on average, be lower than the outside, because what comes inside through doors, windows, other passageways, right, should settle out due to gravity over time, and so it should be less than the outside. Now, that's on average, right, because, hang on, I'm making a note here. That's on average because the outside can vary quite a bit, right? There can be wind, somebody can mow your lawn, there could be snow cover, there can be rain. Inside, you can have kids running around, banging on carpentry and upholstered furniture and stirring it up. It can be very calm. So we need to say normally, right? And we need to think through what else was happening, right? And that leads to the comment that I'll say over and over and probably receive criticism for not saying it, despite the fact I'm going to try to say it, which is the on-site investigation is usually much more important than the lab data. The lab data is one clue. It's one piece of information. It can be a very important or very critical piece of information, but the person, the expert on site who's looking around and knows what the weather was, knows why the sample was taken, knows what they're going to do with the results, knows the context for how it's going to be interpreted. That's very, very important. Right? And sometimes sampling may not be required. Right? That is sometimes a controversial statement, right? But if you're saying, hey, if you walk in and there's clear mold growth on a surface, from a, is this mold growth, do I need to deal with the standpoint, you may not need to take a sample. Now, there may be plenty of other reasons to take a sample, right? You may need it for legal reasons. You may need it for insurance reasons. You may need it for emotional reasons. A person is concerned about their newborn infant and they want, so the sample data can provide emotional security. So there's plenty of other reasons. But if you have known mold growth, and from a strictly like, hey, I've got a moldy ceiling tile, what do I do? You need to fix the water problem and mold the ceiling tile, right? Okay. So we've got this inside sample, we've got the outside sample. On average, we want the inside sample to be lower than the outside. Also, we'd like it to be similar distribution, right? So if outside you have mainly spore type A followed by spore types B, C, D, and then inside you should have mainly A followed by spore types B, C, D, right? If what's inside came from the outside. If you get a grossly disparate distribution, then that pokes holes in the thesis that, or the hypothesis that what's inside came from the outside. Okay, let's take a look at a set of data. Here, I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining this report. Other labs are going to have different formats. We have a whole variety of different formats. They're all going to have, hopefully, basically this type of information. So over here, we have the spore trap data. right? So spore trap meaning we're capturing just the spores. We're capturing the seeds, if you will, that are floating around in the air. We're not growing them. We're not seeing if they're alive. We're not seeing what augers they can or can't grow on. We're just saying, hey, these are floating around in the air, right? So we took it from 4 locations: complaint area 1, complaint area 2, a non-complaint area. So the idea or the concept of an indoor control. So sometimes that can be very helpful. Sometimes it's expensive and you don't want to do it. So, budget is a dominant concern. But if budget's not a dominant concern, or the cost of the analysis is just small relative to the decision that's being made, then an indoor control sample can be useful. And we'll see a couple examples of that, I think. All right, and then we have an outdoor control, right? So why do we take the outside sample? Because a lot of times this is what's telling us what we would expect to see inside for normal business home residences, right? Okay. Now, we've got this yellow columns. Yellow columns are raw counts. This means these are the spores we saw on the slide, right? So we saw 2 of them, or 4 of them, or 1 of them, right? So that's what we saw. The white column is converting it to common units. So if you drive a car around, and you want to know the mileage, you convert it to miles per gallon in the U.S., right? That's what we do. Because you may take a lot of air, you may take a little of air, and so you need to convert it to common units. So that's what we do here. So here we're saying we saw 2 spores of alternaria. We took a sample volume of 75 liters, and that converts to 27 spores per cubic meter of air. Ta-da! Okay. And then this is the total, and then there's going to be some rounding going on. All right. Over here we have the same thing. Culturable air data in terms of format. We've got 4 locations: complaint area 1, complaint area 2, non-complaint area, outdoor sample. This is now culturable data. So with culturable data, we're going to, the sample takes the spores and dumps them onto agar, and we see what grows, right? It's not, I think it's not accurate to call it a viable sample. We are not telling you whether these spores are viable or not. We're telling you which ones will grow on agar, the agar that was provided, right? So there will be viable spores that in the outdoor world could land on an appropriate substrate and have enough water and conditions and grow, that won't grow in the lab. There are some that the world hasn't figured out how to grow in the lab. They don't like the agars that are present. They don't like the conditions that are present. They can't compete with the other organisms that are there, et cetera, et cetera. So we call this very consciously culturable fungal report, because these are the ones that we could culture in the lab. Right? So generally, the culturable results are much lower than the spore trap results. There are some other differences. Usually, by culturing it, you can get a more precise identification because you're growing the organism in the agar, so you get to see the entire organism, if you will, and it allows you to have more precise identification. Right? Sometimes you can't. Right? Sometimes actually the spore trap gives you a more precise identification, but usually you can on the culture data. And we're going to feel like, why does that matter? We'll find out why it matters. Okay, so here's your first set of data. What I'm going to do, just for starters, is I'm going to launch a poll, which means I'm going to ask you to take this, and then I'll talk about the data, and over time I'll get through it. But I just want to start out to get things going here. The question is, do you think this data is suggestive of an indoor source of mold, that the spores that were caught seem more likely to have come from the inside than from the outside, right? And you're going to vote on 3 choices, right? One is, no, it looks like everything that came inside, that was caught on the inside, came from the outside. One is, it's hard to tell. And another is, no, what's inside came from the inside. This looks like a mold problem, right? So let me see if I can use these controls correctly. Select the poll and launch. Okay. So a vote here, and then we'll talk about it. and try to do it. It makes, I think, that more interesting. It'll make you engage more, think more, and we get to share the data with everybody, so it makes it more useful for the other attendees. And then I'll talk about it. We're not going to get a grade. We're not going to get a score. Nobody's going to know how you're voting. Just so take a shot. I'll give you 5 more seconds. 1, 2. All right, I'm going to close it down, and I'm going to share the results. All right, so what we have is about 15% said, hey, this looks clean. About 10% said, I'm not sure. And about 80%, and I know it doesn't add up to 100, said it looks like there's an indoor source. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, so we expect, I would say, that this looks like an inside source, right? Why? Well, if we look at complaint area 2, we've got, for this row 37,000 roughly spores of this spore type inside when we have 80 outside, right? So that's a lot more. Further, many of the spore types that fall in this category are capable of growing on indoor building materials, right? So it's possible they could have come from. Some spore types can't. So rusts, for example, are obligate plant pathogens. So they grow on grasses. They make them rust-colored, hence they're called rusts. And they're not going to grow on wet carpet or sheetrock or wood. And so if you get a high count inside, you're going to look for other sources. You know, maybe somebody has, I don't know, some indoor source that they could grow on, but it's not going to be from the building materials. Okay, so this is a large count. These spores are capable of growing inside, and the distribution looks different, right? So outside, we've got mostly cladosporium. We've got a handful of smuts, Paraconium myxomycetes. We've got a handful of basidiospores, some other stuff, right? Not much on a percentage basis of penasp, whereas inside, here we've got a whole pile of them, right? And it's in a complaint area, right? Over here, we have the same story, right? Here, penicillium, we've got a whole bunch, 31,000 of them. And you'll notice there's a greater than. This is an artifact of the sampling method and the analytical method. And so if you'd like, offline, I can talk about why that's here. And you'll notice if you look carefully, there's some nonlinear math going on here. I can talk about that offline. I don't want to take the time here in this webinar, but I could explain all that. Okay. The same argument, right? Penicillium can grow on indoor building materials. This is a large number for this spore type. This is a high percentage for this sample of penasp compared to penicillium compared to cladosporium. The distribution inside doesn't match that outside. So it leads me to say, look, it is much more likely that these spores came from the inside than they came in through a door and a window, because that scenario gets hard to explain all the other items that we just discussed. Okay. Now, this is a case where you see this analytical method. This here we said, hey, look, we don't know that this is penicillium. All we can do is say this is penicillium or aspergillus or types, things that look like penicillium aspergillus. Why is that? What the heck's going on? Okay, with this analytical method, it's like me showing you just a seed of a plant and saying, what is this? And sometimes you can be precise. Sometimes you can say, hey, Dave, that's an avocado pit. That came from an avocado tree. Right? Or, hey, that's a walnut or macadamia nut or sunflower seed. You can be fairly precise just based on the seed. Right? Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're going to go, oh, that's a type of, I'm not a plant person, I don't know. But you can imagine that's a type of rose bush, but you can't tell what type of rose it came from. I don't know. That may be wrong. I'm making it up. Right? But conceptually, sometimes you can't get enough information from the looks of the seed to get a precise identification. And with penicillium and aspergillus and some other fungal types, all these spores are small, round, colorless, without enough unique identifying features to separate them out, right? And so we call them penasp type. Now, if you grow it, then you get to see what the structures look like, and you get how the spores are arranged, and you can start to say, aha, this is penicillium. All right. Next. Project B. Same question. We're going to launch another poll here, right? So I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to look at this, and you're going to get the same question. Does this suggest mold growth inside or mold source inside of spores? Not sure, or it looks clean? Same question. I'm going to launch a poll. There you go. All right. Vote. Even if you're wrong, it's okay. Give you 5 more seconds. All right, I'll close it. Share the results. All right. So here we kind of flip-flopped. Right now we've got 70% saying this looks clean, about 20% not sure, and about 10% saying it looks like an inside source. All right, let's go take a look. Okay, so I would say based just on these, it looks pretty clean. Why? Well, a couple things. The outside, well, so what's inside? There's nothing inside that's dramatically higher than the outside in a real number, right? You could say epicoccum, here we have 13 spores inside and none outside, so it's an infinite ratio or some stuff like that. Okay, this was 1 spore, right? So yes, the inside is higher than the outside, but it's 1 spore. Right? We're not going to run off a cliff based on 1 spore, right? Are there some others here that are moderately higher? Alternaria, same thing. It's 1 spore. Yes, it's an allergen. Yes, it could be growing indoors, but it's 1 spore. That's well within the range of normal variation. In the absence of other data that would support the hypothesis that it came from the inside, I'm not going to do anything with that. I'm not going to worry about it. Over here, nothing. So basically, the inside's lower than the outside, and importantly, it has the same basic distribution, right? Outside is mainly basidiospores. These inside samples are mainly basidiospores. Here's then followed by ascospores. It's really, this is basidiospores followed by ascospores and followed by cladosporium, right? Basically, you look at these and you go, yeah, the distribution of spores looks the same. There's nothing dramatically different. Same thing over here, right? So I'd say that looks clean. Now, we're going to head to false positives. So if we go back to Project A, we say, hey, look, most of the people on this webinar, plus I think this is suggestive of an inside source. Now, I think people are aware of the idea of a false negative result, meaning the results look like this, and most people looking at this, and I would look at this and say, hey, this doesn't suggest an inside source, but it turned out there is an inside source. And if you go to the AIHCE conference in Seattle, you'll probably find a talk where they say, hey, we did this mold investigation and there was black mold all over 3 of the walls, and we took air samples and nothing was recovered inside, right? That's a false negative. There is mold growth, but the sample didn't recover, okay? There are also false positives, right? I think most people get false negatives, got it, right? No, here's tails about it, got it, right? But you can also get false positives. So this is an example of a false positive, right? In this case, complaint area 1 and complaint area 2 were basically the same area, right? It was two areas that had very similar traits, very similar, and they may have been connected, right? But what happened was a person came, right? They took the sample here, went over to complaint area 2, set up, and then to take their sample, they're all ready to go, and then a person came in and pulled out a filter and said, hey, can you analyze this too? Sure, put it over in the corner. What just happened was kind of this atom bomb of spores just went off because this filter came in and was disturbed, right? It released spores. The samples caught it. Ta-da, here they are. But it was not due to mold growth that was in that room. It was due to this filter that had been opened and shaken and disturbed, and all this stuff came off, right? And in hindsight, you go, oh, of course you shouldn't do that, right? But the reality is when you're in the place and you're worried about your timers and your calibration standards and filling out the chains of custody and where you're going to set things up and blah, 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 it can be missed. So the point of this is to sanity check the results. Do these make sense? And in this case, the investigator looked at the results afterwards and said, these don't make sense. And they mentally went through what happened, what happened, what happened, and then they went, oh, right, I missed it, right? So sanity check. So false positives. Okay, this is the effect of vacuuming, right? So this is activity in, and these were anecdotal studies. These are not for publication. They're not rigorous. They're just, we asked analysts, hey, if you've got time, do the following samples. Well, find some spare bandwidth and analyze the samples. Okay, so here's the outside sample. This is a log scale. Here's before vacuuming, right? Here's while vacuuming, 30 minutes later, and an hour and a half later, right? So here you can see the vacuuming. If you squint, right, these all look kind of similar in terms of a distribution, right? You've got kind of the blue, green, purple, gray, right, bars coming along. There's not some spike. We'll see a spike later. The vacuuming stirred it up, right? And it stirred up a few other spore types that were probably caught in the carpets, right? Very low levels. This is probably one spore, right? Converts to about 13 spores per cubic meter. Stopped vacuuming, things settled back down. This leads to a point, right? This is only 30 minutes, right? And we've dropped by a factor of 5, call it, right? There is a study that showed, right? I think sometimes you'll hear people talk, and there's this, I think, this belief that, oh, these are small, they are small, and they can stay in the air for, you know, hours or weeks, long periods of time, which arguably is true, right? There's evidence of spores at, I don't know, 30,000 feet and crossing the oceans and floating around for long periods of time, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I got it, right. But in a still environment, they settle out relatively quickly. So some researchers did still environment as in like a sealed box, right? Not with people walking around in fans and HVAC, but it's you know, truly still air. They showed that a penasp spore, Penicillium aspidos, the smallest one on the small end of mold spores, 2 to 5 micron diameter probably. I'm not a mycologist, so I probably shouldn't say that, but small. Settles about 1 meter in an hour, right? So that's relatively quick, right? So if you have a sealed room and it's been sealed for 8 hours, much of the spores in there are going to settle out. A Stachybotrys spore on the larger end of the spectrum, not as aerodynamically evolved to stay airborne as long, settled out that meter. I think it was either 6 or 9 minutes, you know, quicker. Actually, really quick, if you think about it. Okay. Now, making the bed. Same thing, whimsical, so the order of these, just bear with me. Here's your outside sample. Before making the bed, while making the bed, 20 minutes later, 40 minutes later. Really not much change. I was actually surprised by these results. Here's throwing out moldy apple pie. So this was intentionally left the food to mold, threw it out, took a sample, and now you say, aha, this is now 1 million spores per cubic meter of air. And this is about 7 feet away from where the apple pie was thrown out, right? So distribution is dramatically different, counts much higher. You'll notice one question is, well, where did the other ones go? Well, my guess is that this type of count, it could have easily obscured these others back here, right? These are counts of 1, 2 spores on the slide, and here you've got much more than that on the slide. This is a converted count, spores per cubic meter, so it's not the raw count on the slide, but you imagine that it's just covered with it, so these got hidden. Does it change the results? Like if we were to add the interpretation, if we were to add these to this? No, right? This is an inside source, right? These spores came from mold growth inside. Now in this case, it was moldy food. So what's the remediation? You're probably done, right? Okay, here is throwing out a moldy scone. Outside sample, before the toss, afterwards, half hour later, you can see this that's dropping measurably over the course of an hour, hence the earlier discussion about settling rates in still air. this was Penicillium aspergillus. That's what was growing on the scone. You'll notice the distribution, right? Sure, there's a large count, right? So that helps a lot. I'll grant you that. But also the distribution is totally different. It's not like this whole thing went up, bam. No, it's just what was growing went up, bam. So the distribution changes dramatically. Moldy persimmon, same story. I mean, it just leaps out at you. Here's before, bam, right? This was Smuts Periconia myxomycetes. That's what was going. Half hour later, right, it dropped by 2 orders of magnitude. And then an hour later, you can just see normal variation going on. Boom, boom, boom. Right here's normal variation of ascospores. None, some, none, some. Just little bits floating around, right? All right. We did a bunch of moldy food, right? You can see them here. We don't need to go through them all. The message is the same for all of them. A couple of them do hit these big numbers, right? That's not the same across the board because these are whimsical. We were asking our analysts to do it at home on their own time. So I'm not going to critique the rigor of this. This was just, take a look. All right. Here we go, interpretation sample. So I'm going to launch a poll, same question. And so same question. In the background, there's another question. For those of you who've looked at lots of sets of data, there's also something odd about this data. And so question 1, and that's what the poll is going to ask, does this suggest a mold source insight, right? For people who answer that quickly, question 2 is, what's odd about the data, and what does that mean, or what are possible answers for why the data is odd? Okay, I'll let you take a look at this. All right, I'm going to launch the poll. Oops. There you go. All right. Please vote. I think it makes you more engaged, and we get to share more results with the larger group. And I think it's helpful for people to realize the variation in how people interpret the data out there. Give you 5 more seconds. I'll close it. Share it. All right. You can see the data there. About 3/4 of everybody on this call thinks it looks like there's an inside source. All right. I would agree. Right. So based on this, Penicillium aspergillus types, these are large counts, both from the complaint area, and these are large counts for these fungal types, and they are from fungi. They include fungal types that can colonize indoor building materials, so it's possible they're growing on stuff inside. And the distribution inside is dramatically different than what's outside. And what's odd about this data is we've got, I would call, very clear suggestive evidence of mold growth inside that does not show up on this sampling type, right, on this set of data. And the question is why? Why is that? Well, this is culturable, right? So we need the spores to be alive. We need them to like the agar that's presented, and we need them to compete with the other organisms that were present, right? So one of those failed. It doesn't look like a sampling error or an analytical error, which is possible, right? But this looks like real, like normal data. It's not like these were totally blank, which would then suggest either an analytical error or sampling error or something happened wrong, who knows, right? And so from this, I would suggest probably these are no longer viable. So for some reason, they were killed, treated with something, or they dried out, fashion that caused them to no longer be viable, or something else, right? But they can still be an allergen. It should still be remediated, but maybe the water problem's been fixed, or who knows. All right. Okay, we are going to talk about kind of a common means for interpreting data. Many people like to use the rule of thumb that says if the inside is greater than 10 times the outside, then you have mold growth inside. And this 10 comes from not like scientific data, it's just because we've got typically 10 digits on our hands, and so that's the unit we tend to use. And it's kind of a fudge factor for saying, hey, look, you know, we want the inside, if there's no mold growth, to be less than the outside, and but we know that the inside varies, and we know that the outside varies, so I'm going to use a safety factor of 10. Ta-da! And if so, we've got a problem. I would advocate strongly, don't do that, right? Look at the data like we are today, think about the data like we are today, and look at each set of data on its own merits, and don't stick to this factor of 10 thing, because sometimes it's just wrong, right? So for example, here's an example. Inside, spore levels are 400 spores per cubic meter, right? That's on the low side, certainly in the realm of normal. And outside, because it was a desert, it's easy to find conditions in desert communities where the outside was below the detection limit to 200 spores. So if you're below the detection limit, you've got 400 inside, ta-da, you've met this factor, safety factor of 10, right? And it does not mean that there's mold growth inside, right? It means these other parameters you just talked about, soft and low outside, but what's outside came inside and got trapped in, you know, in carpet and clothing and in the dust, and so it's easy to get stirred up and get above this 400, right? Mold found on surface samples. Okay, I think if you look hard enough in most buildings, you can find mold on a surface sample, right? And so this requires, where was the mold found, right? What are the conditions, right? If it was a bathroom or showers, it's easy to find mold growth there, and it may not indicate a long-standing water problem and a health problem, so we need more information. But just based on this data and this rigid criteria, in this case, they said, oh, this is amplification, we've got to evacuate the building, so the contaminants or the contents are contaminated and need to be discarded. That's an extreme reaction, right? And that's what caused insurance companies to say, hey, no, we're not going to insure this anymore. And we're going to, you know, I think it hurt our whole industry, because there are cases that is a problem that needs to be dealt with. And we need to be careful that we interpret results in a manner that represents reality and not this kind of extreme reaction. Okay. Just a reminder, we're talking about data here. Yep, got it. But there are many other factors that need to be taken into account, such as why they're being sampled and what the conditions are at the time of sampling. But I want to talk about here, I've said, hey, look, be careful of these inside-outside ratios and this factor of 10. Okay, got it, Gallup. What do we do instead? All right. We embarked, well, think about it like we're talking about here, but that requires information that the lab has often and the investigator may not. So let's talk about some of that. We said, look, people need a rule of thumb to interpret the data, right? They took the data, all right, what do we do with it? Okay, so we looked at existing rules of thumb, right? So one was this indoor-outdoor ratio, right? And some people say, hey, I'm going to use an indoor-outdoor ratio of 1 or 5 or 10, right? So we took a look at that. There's a statistical method that people use briefly. I think it's largely ignored now, but we looked at it. There's Spearman rank correlation. That's a genuine statistical method with lookup tables, and it's a little bit tricky, not super tricky, but takes some effort and thought to do it, to compare two lists and say, are these lists similar or are they different? And so people are saying, hey, if they're similar, then what's inside came from the outside, and if they're different, then what's inside didn't. So we took a look at that hypothesis. Agreement ratios, a very, very simplistic way of comparing two lists. We took a look at that. And then we also developed our own method called mold score, because Spearman rank correlation, agreement ratios, these are things that are designed to compare lists, but not fungal lists, right? So there's information about fungi that make these, we thought, and we went and looked at it, fail, right? These don't know about the fungi, right? So they don't know, hey, rust can't grow on indoor building materials, but penicillium can, cladosporium can, alternaria can. They don't know those things, right? And they also don't know what's the normal range of variation, right? So 100's not much. It's actually low for penicillium, but 100's a lot for Stachybotrys. And the range of the numerical range of what you can recover is broad. And those, if you stack those factors together, it causes these to fail, right? But we'll look at it, right? Because that was a theory. They don't work well, and let's go test the theory. So that's what we did. And given we thought these were going to do poorly, we developed our own score, cleverly called mold score. Borderline embarrassing name. But what we did is we said, all right, let's sit and talk to people who looked at lots of sets of data, who are microbiologists, who've done field work, who understand what we're trying to do. So we talked with Dr. Harriet Birch, who's been in this industry 40 or 50 years and has been on 7 National Academy of Science committees looking at this, who worked at the Harvard School of Public Health, doing field surveys, analyzing the data, trying to tease out what it means, understanding the health effects. My mom did over 500 field surveys with Dr. Kozak, an allergist who's treating asthma patients and looking for correlations between mold growth and asthmatic health effects. And she was a mycologist. And so we showed them sets of data and said, what do you think, right? What does this data tell you? And then we compared them, right? So we compared them to what? We took 100 pairs of sets of data with an inside and an outside sample. And yes, taking 2, 3, 4, 5 outdoor samples is better than 1. There is variation. It makes the data harder to interpret. But the reality is most of the projects we receive are 1 inside sample, or well, not 1. Often there's multiple inside samples, but usually just 1 outside sample. So we have to realize that people are making judgments based on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. More is better, but budget constraints don't permit that. So we just have to realize just because it's 1 sample doesn't mean it's garbage. It just means there's a wider error bar. We have to be a little more careful about taking dramatic actions based on 1 sample, but the data has some value. Okay. We took these 100 pairs of samples from Alaska to Florida throughout the year, wide range of spore counts, and we ran all these analytical techniques, and we had the experts analyze them, and we compared the two, right? And so what you'd like to see is a strong correlation between an analytical or an interpretive method or rule of thumb and what the experts think. So with the agreement ratio, we didn't get that, right? So the agreement ratio gives you a number between 0 and 1. 1 says perfect agreement. These lists look very similar. 0 says they're totally different. Experts, we asked them to give this a set of data, a rating between 0 and 100. 100 saying, look, I think highly suggestive there's a mold source inside. I need an answer why. It may be because it was a moldy apple pie. It might be because there's mold growth all over the walls, but the source is inside. 0 means, no, this looks totally clean. I see no evidence that there's mold growth, source of mold spores from the inside. Okay, so here we can say, look, if the agreement ratio correlated with what the experts see when they look at the data, right, then you'd say, oh, agreement ratio of 0.6 means you'd get this, and an agreement ratio of 0.8 means you'll get that. The problem is you don't have that. If you get an agreement ratio of 0.6 and they say, okay, what did the experts say? You can't tell me, because sometimes, so we took those 100 sets of data, right? We ran them through. This is 100 data points. This is 1 set of data. The agreement ratio was 0.89, and the experts said it was, what is that, 11, right? Here, so if the agreement ratio is 0.6, sometimes experts gave it a 1, a 5, a 30, 52, 98, 100, so there's no correlation. So I looked at that and I said the agreement ratio as a means of looking at fungal data is poor. Spearman rank correlation, same thing, right? Spearman rank correlation tends to tell you these lists are the same or these lists are different, right? And so I called that, okay, if they're the same, it's 0. If they're different, it's 100, and I mapped them out. These 6 cases where the number of fungal spores were so low that the Spearman rank correlation couldn't be run, right? It's like saying, what's the standard deviation of 6? Right? Well, I need some other numbers to give you standard deviation, right? And so for those, I just said, all right, I'll call it 50, right? Again, same thing. If you say, hey, the Spearman rank correlation was 0, what were the experts? I have no idea. I can't tell you. So I looked at that and said, okay, the Spearman rank correlation is poor. Here's inside-outside ratio, right? So I said, okay, look, if you have an inside-outside ratio of 10 or higher, we're going to call that 100. That's my fancy conversion. And then we'll scale it up and down. So this is better. There is a trend, right? If you have a high inside-outside ratio, on average, the experts gave it a higher odds of being an indoor mold source. And if you had a low inside-outside ratio, on average, they gave you lower. But there were still significant anomalies, right? So it's better. And that's why I think people use it, because it's better, right? And it tends to correlate better to whether there's something going on. Here is, just for kicks, I wanted to look at just us as humans, us as people influenced by, anyway, blah, blah, blah. So what I did was I gave the same expert, or gave an expert the same set of data twice with a 3-month separation, and they didn't know when they did it the first time. They were going to ask them to do it again the second time. And this is the same person looking at the same set of data twice. So there's a pretty good correlation, but there are notable differences, right? So here, one time they gave it a 50, and the first time they gave it a 30, right? And you know, I showed them the data. Ta-da, we're not hiding anything. And they said, yeah, you know, the first time I did this, I just spent the previous day in court all day, and I was pissed off at the whole industry, right? And so the point of this is, you know, we're people, and we're not going to be totally precise ourselves. Here's mold score versus the experts. And this is actually, on the scale of things, I think a phenomenal correlation. Right? Is it perfect? No, right? But are we as people perfect? No. Is mold score perfect? No, right? But can it be a good, is it a better rule of thumb than inside-outside ratios? I would say yes, clearly. And we'll go through some examples, and you can decide on your own, because you're by yourself. Nobody's pushing you. Nobody's scoring you. You can just, we're going to go through examples, and you decide, yeah, I like it, or no, I don't, right? So here, if you say, hey, look, the mold score was low, then on average, the experts gave it a low score. Not always, right? But on average, right? If the mold score was high, the experts tended to give it a high score. And through the difficult middle part, they correlated pretty well. This is an R-squared number. It's a means of correlating two sets of numbers statistically and saying, hey, is this a good correlation? That's a good correlation. So beautiful. Now, we offer mold score for free. There's no fee for it. We run it through the computer. It pops up a number. Great, right? Those of you who use us and use mold score, you'll notice that this is different than the report you get. That's because we are very aware that mold score has flaws, right? It's not perfect. It's going to have false positives and false negatives. And so we didn't want to give it this clean number from 0 to 100 because we thought it would get overinterpreted or communicate that it's more precise than it is, right? It's just an algorithm. I think it's a very good algorithm. So what we do is we obfuscated it. We intentionally made it not a number like 0 to 100, so it doesn't feel like, oh, there's a 73% chance. No, 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 no. So all we did to obfuscate it was we doubled it. So now it's from not 0 to 100, it's from 0 to 200. And we added 100 to it. So now instead of being 0 to 200, it's from 100 to 300. So when we go through these, just to make the comparison clean, we're going to report it in its original calculated score between 0 and 100. Pre-fancy conversion, I'll multiply by 2 and add 100. All right. So just a reminder about CEUs. When you're done, you'll get a survey. Fill out the survey within 24 hours, and then 2 to 3 weeks later, you'll get an email of your certificate. Well, we have a mobile app. So if you use us, and time's important, the mobile app will send you push notifications, which you can turn off when your reports are available. It looks really good on tablets. The reports do. You can review projects, reports, COCs, invoices. You can go through our pocket guide. You can go through the fungal library. There's a lot of stuff on the app. It's a really nice app, and there's not a fee for it. There's not a charge for it. It's just, I think it's a nice app. We spent a lot of time and effort making that. Okay, pocket guide. This is free. If you'd like, when you fill out the survey, ask for a pocket guide. This is about, I don't know, 1/8 to 1/4 inch thick, and it's pocket sized. So I don't know, it's 3 by 4 inches, and it's got a lot of information in there. Typical mold score values, various standards, various methods. It's free. It's also in a handy dandy mobile app. So if you'd like it, get it. It's free. All right. We also, and then I think we are going to get, okay, we're going to set a date. We have chain of custody online, so if you want, you can log in your own projects online. Good. All right, June in Florida. So now, this is actually a good time. It's both a good and a lousy time to take a break. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a 5-minute break. And I'm going to start back in 5 minutes. This, I think, right, what we've done is we've laid the groundwork for, I think, what's the most interesting part. So please come back in 5 minutes, because I think this is when you get the most. These are harder sets of data to analyze. I think the poll results are more interesting. I think that we'll show you the mold score. We'll show you the inside-outside ratio. We'll show you the agreement experiment. I think this is the guts, the good part. So try to come back in 5 minutes. So 5-minute break. While we're doing this, I'm going to just take a 2-minute break myself, but then I will answer some questions and then we'll dive into it. So 5-minute break. Marvin, if you can stay on the line, sometimes when there's silence, because I'm going to step away for 2 minutes, people get worried that something went wrong. So you can watch the question.
Not a problem.
But, okay, thanks. I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Okay,
I'll answer a couple of questions. Right.
Okay,
thanks.
perfect. I'll be here. Great, thanks.
Thanks.
And again, as mentioned, we're just taking a 5-minute break, but we'll resume here shortly. Thanks, everyone. Okie dokie.
let's answer a couple of questions, and then we'll go through the guts of this one. So let me see if I can get the questions. Questions. Okay, I'm just taking these, is there any information on the airborne spore populations during various activities of remediation in order to determine if loads exceed respirators' ability to protect workers? It's a great question, not that I know of. It may be out there. So that leads to a good source to look for some of these answers to these questions is if you go to pubmed.gov, P-U-B, like publish, med, like medical, pubmed.gov. And this will search the peer-reviewed literature. So the quality of data you get is higher than just the general web. And then still read those, and often you can get the abstract of these papers free. And if it's a particularly good article, sometimes the whole article is free. Sometimes they want $25 or something to support the journal that's spending money to publish them and review them, et cetera. The quality of the journals varies quite a bit. If it's a Nature or Cell paper, that's well, Nature likes to publish really leading edge stuff, so sometimes it's found out later to be false. But anyway, the point is that the quality of these journals varies quite a bit. But read them with a critical eye, and it's better than the web, and they usually have data and methods and materials. And so if somebody's done that rigorously and published it, then it would show up at pubmed.gov. It's a really good source for these types of questions. All right. Can you comment on whether it's really necessary to identify to the species level the fungal evaluation? The examples in the webinar generally indicate that identification of the genus level is sufficient. Oh, I would say that I don't, I think often you don't need to go to the precise identification. Unless you can conceive of cases where, yes, you'd want very specific identification. So, for example, if you're looking at a hospital operating theater and you've got Aspergillus, I'm mixing up two of them, fumigatus. That's very different than if you have epicoccum, because Aspergillus fumigatus, I may be mixing it up with flavus. One of those is produces potent carcinogen. The other is a potent invasive species. Boy, I'm really zooming out. Anyway, whereas epicoccum, right, so if you're worried about nosocomial infections in a hospital, right, then you worry about the fungi that are capable of doing that. And epicoccum doesn't, if I remember correctly, whereas Aspergillus fumigatus is like one of the #1 agents of that. So then it's very different. If it's a normal office or home, you're just looking for, do I have evidence for an indoor source of fungal growth, in which case, if you do, you need to find the source of the water and remediate it, in which case, whether it's mold A, B, or C, I would say usually doesn't matter. You've got the information you need. I have an indoor source of fungal spores. I need to fix it. That's just my opinion. Okay, let's go back here. All right, here we are. This is the guts. I'm going to launch the same poll. Please participate and vote. I'll give you 20 seconds here to look at it. Same question. Mold growth, no mold growth, not clear. All right, let me launch the poll. There you go. Let's vote. Come on, let's vote. Not everybody's back from the break. They can usually usually the first vote after the break is low. Makes me not want to take the break. All right, here we go. All right, so basically 70% think it looks clean, 20% if you will, not sure, and 10% think it looks like a mold problem. All right, let's take a look. Okay, here is so agreement ratio, so we ran them all here. So if you're curious, you can track, and if you download the PDF, you can track it pretty rigorously. The agreement ratio and the Spearman's rank correlation, I'm going to ignore those because I genuinely think those do not do a good job of interpreting fungal data. I'm sure they have uses elsewhere, but not here. I'm going to pay attention to these three, right, and what the class thought, right? So here, the inside edge ratio was basically 2, right, and that came from here, Pithomyces, right, 27 inside and we have 14 outside, so basically a ratio of 2. I don't think that's particularly significant. Mold score and the experts basically saying on the low end, I think it looks clean. I would concur. Basically, there's nothing dramatically higher inside than outside, with this exception of Pithomyces, but it's 4 spores versus 2, a difference of 2. So I'm not going to worry about it. We have Bipolaris Drexlera, 1 spore inside, none outside, 1 alternary inside, none outside. Who cares? Distribution inside generally matches the outside. Interesting, I think a lot of curvularia. That's very atypical to use outside, but we did. But these two look very similar to me. All right, July in Florida, same question. I'll give you 20 seconds or so to look at this and participate. Come on, man. All right, I'm going to launch a poll. All right, we beat last time in terms of voting percentage. We're back in the break. All right, 3 more seconds. All right, anyway, you can see the results there. Let's take a look. All right, inside outside ratio bumped up. Last time it was 2, now it's basically 3. That 3 is coming from this, Penicillium aspergillus. The experts in the mold score went really from it looks clean to it looks like there's an inside source. I need an answer to this. And that's probably from this, Penicillium aspergillus. Why? Well, this is a large number for Penicillium aspergillus. Penicillium aspergillus typically is in the outside in 200, 300 spores per cubic meter. That's very common outside, but not in these types of numbers. Does it happen outside like this? Yes, but not typically. And the distribution, and these can grow on indoor building materials. So 0.2, check. And the distribution inside is dramatically different than the outside, right? So the outside has all this stuff, right? But it's got a bunch of ascospores, a bunch of basidiospores, some cladosporium, some penasp, some pyricularia. That's kind of interesting. Smuts periconia, a whole bunch of stuff, right? Whereas the inside really, 2,200 out of 2,500, if you will, is penasp. It's really penasp. So it looks kind of like that moldy apple pie toss, right? You got a bunch of stuff outside, and inside you got one thing, really. And so the question is, where did that come from? And then find out what the answer is. Maybe it's benign, maybe it's not. All right, April in Oregon. Same questions coming up. All right, let's take a launch. All right, I'll give you 4 more seconds. All right. Here you go, pretty solid consensus. There's a problem. Anyway, inside source of mold scores. Here we go. All right. Inside outside ratio went up to 15, came from this aspergillus. Mold score is pegged. Experts not quite there, but pretty darn close. All right, why? Well, I would be up at the really high end also because we have a dominance inside of Penicillium aspergillus, so we've got 3,300 out of 4,600, so really dominant of so that's a high number. So the distribution inside is very different than the outside. Outside it's 200 out of 6,400, so much lower. If these were coming from the outside, where did these go? Where did these go? These dropped, and this went up a lot. These can also grow on indoor building materials. This is a large number for these spore types. We also have Stachybotrys, and he told me I'm not going to worry about that. Stachybotrys, this is a much lower number than that. Agreed. However, this is a high number for Stachybotrys, right? So it's kind of like you can go outside in some areas of the country in the spring and see just sheets of yellow pine dust on cars and railings, and so large numbers of that are common. But you don't see the same count of avocado pits or macadamia nuts, right? That what's a lot for that type of seed is very different. And here, Stachybotrys is on the avocado pit end of the spectrum, or the coconut end of the spectrum. You don't see a lot of them. So for the Stachybotrys, 100's a lot. And there were none outside. Mind you, sometimes in the outside, we do see 500 of these or something, but it's very unusual. And so you add these all together and you say this just, to me, it's much more likely this came from the inside than outside. All right. December, North Dakota. All right. So December, North Dakota, what's that mean? Well, it probably means there could be snow on the ground, in which case your outside counts are going to be reduced, or it could be very cold, very still. Anyway, and so now you have to fuss with the fact that this may not be the typical outside data, right? All right, so, but you still, we still have a job to do. What's this mean? How do we interpret this data? We're going to watch a poll here again in 20 seconds or so. This will be an interesting poll. Please vote. Please vote. Here we go. Come on, it's much more interesting when lots of people vote. There we go. We're getting to new records of voter participation. Come on. Okay, 3, 2, 1, close. All right, very interesting, right? So this goes back to our first slide, right, where the range, that's pretty big spectrum, pretty big spread. All right, let's hide it. And this panel, take a look at this. All right, inside outside ratio was 11, coming off of this row. Mold score is 23, experts 58. So I didn't cherry pick these, so these always line up, right? I'm trying to just show you, here's the type of data we had, right? All right, so the question, there's a lot here. All right, so when I look at this, I'm kind of modeling in my head, instead of this, what's typically in the outdoor air? And that's what mold score does. Mold score will sanity check the outside sample, and if it's really kind of atypically low, like if we had the desert environment we talked about earlier, or if there's snow cover reducing outdoor spore counts, it's not going to pay as much attention to distribution, nor to compared to the outside, nor to inside-outside ratios compared, well, outside compared to that, yeah. All right. And so it's going to look at what's more typical in the outdoor air and what can colonize indoor building materials, and it's going to kind of model, look at this differently. So here, open area, this is just 2. I'm not going to weight that too much, right? Deciduous forest, low. Caudiflorians, low. Epicocum, 1, I'm not going to worry about it. It's 1 spore. Other brown, not a big deal. Penasp, this is really kind of in the normal range. It'd be nice to know what's going on the outside. No, inside rather. Outside is typically 200 to 300, as I mentioned earlier. We've got 1 Pistolomyces. I'm not going to worry about it. 5 of these. 1 Stachybotrys, very interesting, right? There's an article, 1-pager written, like, what's the sound of 1 Stachybotrys spore falling? Kind of tongue-in-cheek reference to various Zen thoughts. 1 Torula. I look at this, and I'm biased on the lower side because this is kind of just a nice, even smattering of lots of different things, which to me looks more like outdoor air rather than like a moldy apple pie or a moldy scone. Usually if there's a source of mold growth, you get a dominance of 1 or 2 spore types, and we don't have that. So it pushes me more towards the, if I were to give it a score, 30 end of the spectrum, which admittedly disagrees with the experts, right? So arguably this is more correct, but I just look at this and go, you know, it's not just one thing. It's a whole bunch of different things. So that looks more normal to me. All right. November in Florida. Florida has fascinating air. You have mold allergies, steer clear of Florida. Live in North Dakota in the winter. I'm going to launch another poll here. All right, here we go. All right. Let's see if we can hit another record for attendance or voting participation, not attendance. Give you 5 more seconds. We're not there. Come on, vote. There's no downside to voting on this spectrum. 3, 2, 1. Close. All right. Look at that spread. Real disagreement. So let's talk about that. That's fascinating. All right. Results. Sorry, I've got to move panels around to get to the screen. The webinar interface. All right, here we go. Inside-outside ratio is 3. You'll notice as we've gone through this, right, the inside-outside ratio has not correlated very closely with mold score or the experts. And this one is very interesting, right? We had a third, crudely speaking, from everybody's on the call. All right. What do we have? We have an interesting set of data. All right, the question is what to do with this, really, right? Because this is lower than the outside, this is lower, 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 right? This is lower. So everything inside is less than the outside, except for this, right? And the distribution really inside is dominant penasp, right? So overall, we've got 1,200 spores inside and we've got 13,000 outside. All right, but this is 900 out of 1,200 and this is 270 out of 13,000, right? So the distribution inside to me is dramatically different than the outside. And this is relatively high for penasp, and these can colonize indoor building materials. So I would be biased higher, right? So I would look at this and say, okay, I'd give this 2/3 or 3/4, right? Call it 60 or 70 if I were to pick a score, which is closer to this. Actually, these two are pretty close, right? Why wouldn't this be higher? It's just because when you have this in the background, it makes me, like if we had this set of data, where am I going? Here in North Dakota, I'd probably rate it higher. Because I'd say, okay, that's a really unusual distribution, and it's high for PennAsp. But in the background, we've got this going on. And so if you model this over time, it wouldn't surprise me to see later that day or a high count of PennAsp. So that's why I wouldn't move this further up to closer to 100. I'd keep it in the 2/3, 3/4 range, or 60, 70 range. All right. September in Alaska. Take a look at this. All righty, we'll launch a poll. Good participation this time. All right, 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Close. Share. All right. Strong bias towards it looks clean. All right. Okay, this will surprise you then. Inside-outside ratio is only 1, right? So that's coming from this line. But most of the experts are pegged, saying that they think this is an inside source. So let's think about this, right? Because I disagree strongly with most of the voting results. All right. If we're saying this looks clean, then we're saying what's inside came from the outside. Okay. And on the surface, I get that, right? Oh, 5,000 outside, 5,000 inside. Right. But if we're saying what's in the air here came from the outside, then we're saying that there is a path from the outside to the inside that does the following. It takes 1,900 ascospores and lets 1/4 of them through. Right? 25% transfer rate. It takes 11,000 cladosporium and lets 300 of them through. So it's going to filter out 97% of the cladosporium. It filtered out 75% of the ascospores. It took Epicoccum 50, that's 4, this is 12, who cares? PennAsp, it took 18,000 and let 500 through. Right, so it took out 97% of the PennAsp. It took out 1,000 Smuts periconia and only let 13 through, so it took out 99% of that. Right, it took out all the Eurycladium. But the basidiospores, somehow that pathway from the outside to the inside that's taking out 75, 95, 97, 99% of the spores is letting basically 100% of the basidiospores through. Right? So if we say we've got 2 choices, A, they came from the inside, or B, they came from the outside. If they're saying they came from the outside, I need more details of like, what is so magical about that screen door or that open window that filters out basically everything except basidiospores? Or we can say, no, the path from the outside to the inside filters out basically everything except there's an inside source of basidiospores. And basidiospores come from basidiomycetes, of which some are agents of wood decay, in which case that could be not only an indoor source, but it could be a structural integrity problem. That, to me, seems more likely. That's where I'd want the investigation to go before I wrote this off saying, look, this looks clean. So I think this then I think is an example of a possible benefit of mold score. Mold score is certainly wrong some of the time, and certainly wrong sometimes false positives, false negatives. But this could be a case where you use it like an expert who understands sources of fungi and what's typical levels and what's going to grow inside and what's growing inside. And you say, hey, what do you think? Right? And you may say, you know what, I disagree. Great, because you're the investigator, you're on site, you know what's happening, you know what the weather was and what the building was like, and you know all this very important information. But sometimes it may make you say, you know what, right? Why is that? And look again and think through this, right? So if you can see the logic in my description of why I would look at this as an inside source, then it adds value. If not, that's totally up to you. I don't need to answer to me at all. Okay, December in New York. Here we go. Give you 5 more seconds. All right, here we go. So we go basically 3/4 of the class, if you will, thinks it looks like there's an inside source and then evenly split with the other 2. All right, let's take a look at the data. And, sorry, it takes me a couple of clicks to clear my screen. All right, here we've got inside address ratio 2.5 coming from this. Yep. Mold score and experts are kind of biased towards there's a problem. And this is December in New York, right? December in New York, yeah, okay. So, all right, so the question here is, yeah, I would agree with these guys. Not that I'm the expert here, but I'm just sharing my thoughts, right? Same thing about penasp. This is a high count for penasp. They can grow into a building materials, and the issue is this distribution differs, I think, meaningfully from the outside, right? So the outside has this. It has, 600, if you will, out of 2,200 is penasp, and we got 1,500 out of 2,100. That's meaningfully different to me, so I'm biased towards what's going on inside, noting that I would just want to look around more to see where these are coming from. Okay. So conclusions, I think, I'm a fan. I'm naturally biased. I was heavily involved in development of and can see the value of mold score. When people call me to ask me to interpret the data, I actually will run mold score to kind of sanity check my initial thoughts. That being said, there have been some times where I've seen set the data and I say, you know what, I disagree. But I find it as a good kind of just sanity check to catch me from being kind of too reflexive. All right. Variability. When we've had this, gone through this, I've made statements like, that's a high level for this sport type, or that's a high level for that sport type, or made kind of the off-the-cuff comments that, oh, this, what's inside varies a lot, and what's outside varies a lot. So we like to be data-based, and so let's take a look at what is that variability, right? So we did some variability with inside things, vacuuming, throwing out moldy food, making the bed. Let's take a look at the outside. So here is a sunny day aerosol. Ta-da! This is there's some cladosporium in here, some alternaria in here. I think I'm not a mycologist, so I should probably be really quiet. But the point is that looks different than the start of rain, which looks different than when it's raining more heavily. You can see here these I think are ascospores. So ascospores and basidiospores have active mechanisms that shoot their spores into the air when it starts to rain or it's raining, right? If it's rains for a long time or it rains very heavily, it can wash them out of the air. But for example, puffball mushrooms, we've all seen those fun things. You know, they're fun to tap, kick, you know, play with, etc. Those produce basidiospores, and that's what's coming out when you kick them are spores, and they're designed so that when they're disturbed, such as through rain, they send spores into the air. Right, rain hits top of them, and little puffs of these can go off. Ascospores, I think, absorb the water and can kind of squeeze and actively shoot spores into the air. But eventually they're done, right? What's going to get sent into the air is done, and then they can get washed clean. And so the point of these three is to show what's in the air outside varies, right? So let's try to quantify that. We have generated this set of data called mold range, another very clever name, where we said, hey, look, it's our job as a lab to try to help interpret and put our data, the data we produce, to help from just a biological or microbiological sense, and put it in context, right? So we have compiled data from over 600,000 outdoor spore traps. So we said that's a lot, right? Let's try to compile that, and even though there's issues, there's certainly going to be flaws or errors or weird things in the data. 600,000 is large enough that we can look at the data in aggregate, and as long as we don't get carried away with over-interpreting it, that's a useful set of data. So what's that data have? Here is an older set of data. We should really update that. Actually, let me make a note. I'm trying to do this. All right. So what we have here is two things. This is month across the bottom. This set of gray bars is the frequency of recovery measured against this axis. Right? Yeah, we've got a whole bunch of zeros here and a whole bunch of zeros. We don't have that much precision. We don't kid ourselves, but it's just the graphing software does that. So you can see that in May, you've got 80% of the time you recover Penicillium aspergillus in spore traps in the outside air. Right? So it's very common. And then in the fall, it's more prevalent. 95% of the time you recover it in the outdoor air. So you expect to see it, right? However, that means in May, 20% of the time, you don't recover it, right? But these spores, on average, have been going into homes, and they're caught in the dust and the carpetings. And so you could, in this situation, easily see, right, that, hey, we caught penasp inside, but we didn't outside. And now, if you get carried away with the inside-outside ratio, you could say, oh, we have a mold problem inside because the inside-outside ratio is blah, blah, blah. It's really high. We didn't get it outside. Well, no. What you have then is, based on this data, you have an atypical outside sample rather than indications of mold growth inside. So that, to me, is the value of this data, is it helps put things in perspective to say, is it the inside sample that's unusual, or is it the outside sample that's unusual? All right. These other lines are when it's recovered. So if we take just this 80%, where we've recovered penasp outside, and we say, how much did we get? Well, 50%, the 50th percentile value is here measured against this axis. So it's here, call it 200 spores per cubic meter of air. So now you can say, look, when we recover it, we expect to see it in these quantities. Sometimes it's as high as 3,500, right? So that's the 97.5 percentile value. Is 3,500, right? And then the barely find it is down here at the detection limit, basically. So it gives you a much better sense for what is penasp doing in the outside air, right? This is another way of looking at the data, taking a look at cladosporium in Arizona, right? So we say, oh, the outside berries, the outside berries, the outside berries. Okay, this is one sample. Hey, this is sample number, so I don't have time to year data presented here. This is a log scale, right? So it's showing some of the time we've got, tens, and some of the times we have over 10,000, right? And between 100 and 1,000 is very common, right? So what's the difference between, 200 and 300 or 200 and 250? Not much, right? Because this is what's going on in the outdoor air. So the point of this is to say, don't get carried away. So you'll notice, maybe you've noticed, as we've gone through these sets of data, I've rounded pretty generously, right? That's because this is the background. So you can't be saying, oh, it's 22.7. No, look, it's 20, it's 30, it's 100, right? Okay. This is Arizona, again, Penicillium aspergillus. Same thing, log data, right? Routinely between 100 and 1,000. And here we had one that's way out here, right? So this is an atypical outdoor sample, right? Imagine trying to get an inside-outside ratio of 10 when this is the outside sample, right? And if you had 10,000 on your inside sample, you should probably be thinking more of this is the outside data rather than, gee, I got unlucky and I had one of these. Unless there's a reason for why this is outside. You're outside of some, I don't know, orange orchard in late in the season in Florida that's all covered with penicillium. All right. Here's Alternaria in California. Right. Now, this data has variation, but it's materially different than this and this, right? Here you're pinging between 100 and 1,000, easy. Multiple thousand, easy, right? Between 100 and 1,000, easy. Multiple thousands, easy. No, if you get 1,000 Alternaria, that's unusual, right? So if you get, if you get 200, come on computer, if you get 200, 300, 400 penasp inside, and you happen to get none outside, you can say, well, yes, it's higher than the outside, right? And 200 to 400, but it's in the context of this is what's typically in the outdoor air. If you get 200, 300, 400 Alternaria inside, no, that's more significant, right? Because this is the context of what's in the outdoor air. It's tens, not multiple hundreds, not multiple thousands. So you look at that data differently, right? Okay. So if you'd like, as an EMLab client, this is a free report. What we do is we take the data and we try to put it in context as best we can, noting that there's flaws with all this, but it's better than nothing, I think. I think this is very useful. So if people call me and say, hey, Dave, what do you think of this data? I pull both a multiple report and I pull one of these. Okay, what does this do? This tells us, here's the actual outdoor sample, right? So I can't create a report, ta-da, that here's sets of outdoor data because, and we did that intentionally because we can't just use the typical outdoor data to interpret what's going on. You need to take the outside sample at that location to put the data in context with the outside data in that location. This is not to replace actual outdoor air samples. So we have to have the outdoor sample. This is what you got. All right. Then we say, look, this is February in Ohio. This is the entire year in Ohio, right? So February, and it tells you the sample size, right? 654 samples, 11,000, 12,000 samples. So it's a real set of data. It's not whimsical. And we say, here's how often these spore types are recovered. So you can say cladosporiums recovered 58% of the time in the outdoor air in Ohio in February, based on 650 samples, right? Stachybotrys is recovered 2% of the time, right, in February in Ohio. Right? Then we say when you recover, so if you take just this 58%, what are the low, medium, and high values? So here, I think this is 10 percentile, 20th, 50th, 80th, and 90th percentile values. So you can see that cladosporium changes a lot. The entire year, it's clipping along 750 to 5,700 spores per cubic meter, and in the winter, February, it's much lower, right? So that helps you put things in context. You can see the same thing. Deciduous spores changes quite a bit, 14,000, 1,500 versus 100 and 1,400, right? Lots of times there's these dashes. So here we say, look, Stachybotrys is recovered 2% of the time, but 2% of 654 samples is only 13 samples where we recovered Stachybotrys, so we're not going to give these values. Because we say making statistics out of a sample size of 13 is not a good thing to do. So we just put dashes because we don't know what typical values are. Here we've got 2% out of 11,000. All right. And now we've got a couple hundred samples. Now we can tell you what's typically found outdoors. Okay. We also break these into generally able to grow indoors and seldom found growing indoors. And we use these terms generally and seldom because there's always these exceptions. There are exceptions to these. For example, earlier we talked about with Alaska, basidiospores, right? Usually basidiospores come from the outside from puffball mushrooms and other things, right? But sometimes they're coming from inside. Sometimes mushrooms are growing inside, or sometimes they're agents of wood decay. But on average, these are coming, not growing on indoor building materials. Okay. We also realize that some states, there's variation within the state of what's typically found outside, such as California, where the climate is very dramatic from Death Valley to the Sierras, which are 14,500 feet. And you've got all these coastal communities that have very different than looking inside in the deserts. So we created, what we did is we said, look, we'll take those that we found in California and not break them up just by month and entire year. We'll also break it up by climate code. So we took California and we broke it up using the Köppen-Geiger, kind of a known climate categorization system that tells you temperature extremes and elevation and what, et cetera. And we said, okay, we're going to break California up to climate. So what we did then is we compiled outdoor mold data by zip code, and then we took all the zip codes that were from a similar climate. So on the coastal regions, right, we took all the zip codes that border the coast and compiled the data from that, as opposed to in the desert areas. And so you get an even more precise report. Note here, Stachybotrys is found 6% of the time, based on a sample, 12,000 samples. 6% of the time, Stachybotrys is recovered in the outdoor air. So that can help you not to say, oh, ignore Stachybotrys, because if you have Stachybotrys growing indoors, you should deal with it, right? But if you have somebody who says, oh, I found one spore, my infant's going to die because of the toxins found it, you can say, no. You can help on the emotional side to get people to get the emotions out so you can deal with this on a data basis rather than just the emotional basis. Here, cladosporium, 98% of the time found outside. Very helpful data. Okay, California we did specifically. Some states, such as Florida, have all one climate code if you use this Köppen-Geiger climate code. So what we did is we downloaded 890,000 data points from the NOAA database of rainfall and weather and temperature and elevation. And we broke states that are in green here, so including California, into their own climates. And so we made our own climate codes based on that data set. And so we can give you a mold range local climate. So if you tell us your zip code, we will take that zip code, compile the data from other zip codes in that state that have similar weather patterns, and tell you what's typically found there. And we'll tell you it's based on annual temperature, elevation, rainfall, and temperature range. So for Arizona, for example, and map it out. So I think it's very helpful. All right. A couple more projects here, and a couple more polls. I'll go quickly. I'll give you a moment to look at this. Actually, let me take a look. Okay, I'm a little worried about time. So look at this set of data, and we'll run a poll. Same poll. All right, let's launch this poll. I've only got 2 more polls, this one and one more. Then I run out, so last chance to vote. Second to last chance to vote. Give you 5 seconds. All right, share the results. 50, 30, 20. All right, let's take a look. Whoops. All right, I don't actually have the mold score and everything else. All right, so when I look at this, I would say I'd want to know what's happening. If I look just at the spore trap data, which is this, so project D3 is D1 and D2, and I'm going to look at them separately. Spore trap data. This to me looks pretty clean. There's nothing here that sends a flag, right? The counts inside are generally lower than the outside. There may be an exception or two. Doesn't look like it. And just it really looks, and the distribution inside pretty much mirrors that at the outside. No concerns. Project D2 is now the culturable data. This leaps out at me, acrimonium, right? So these are both complaint areas, not the indoor control, not outdoors. These are, while they're 10 and 20, that's not 1 and 2. Those are real numbers for acrimonium. Acrimonium can grow in indoor building materials. So I'd want to know where these came from, right? What's going on. Now, that leads to the question, why did the spore trap miss this data? Well, acrimonium spores are small, round, and colorless, so they could have been counted here, penasp types. The other thing is there's heavy background debris. So when we take a spore trap sample, we're collecting not just the spores, but we're collecting skin cells and pollen and dust and talcum powder and all this other things, right? And so sometimes if we get too much of that, it can obscure or hide spores. And so here we're maxed out. 4 is the largest rating we get. We've got 4+ background debris. There's a lot of stuff on there, and could it hide a few of these spores scattered around there? Sure. Could they get labeled as penasp types? Sure. And the outside has other penasp types, but they're not acrimonium? Sure. So it can miss it. All right. Here's another one for you. E2. So we've got spore trap, culturable data. What do you think? Last poll coming up. I'm going to launch the poll. Give 5 more seconds. All right. How was that? Share the results. All right. Pretty broad spread there. Let's take a look. All right. I would want, I'm biased towards an inside source. So how am I doing time? Okay. Here is just the spore trap data. So I went backwards, right? This is E1 and E2. This is E1 here, right? E1, just E1 by itself does not suggest a problem. The inside is generally lower than the outside, very similar distribution. The only thing that might suggest a problem is that the indoor control is different than the complaint area. If you didn't have the indoor control, these two sets of data look like that. And so I'd go, yeah, that's fine, right? But non-complaint makes you go, why do these look different than this? And so the question is, how different is the non-complaint area from this indoor control, if you will, from the indoor complaint areas? If you add the culturable data, now the question is similar to D2. Where did these come from? These are capable of growing on indoor building materials. These are real numbers for Aspergillus versicolor. They're not present outside. Where did they come from? They're not in the complaint area. And so this leads to the question of why did E2 miss it? And it's because these are Aspergillus, so they went into this row here, Aspergillus. Penicillium also went into this row, and it turns out that this level of Aspergillus with very little penicillium gets totaled here. Compared to the outside, we have quite a bit of penicillium and not aspergillus, and that goes here. So the outdoor penicillium masks the indoor aspergillus just because this type of analysis can't separate the two, whereas this type of analysis can. Now, so this is a case that would argue take cultible samples. Right? Now, sometimes people don't have the time, it takes time, sometimes they don't have the budget, okay, but be aware of the limitations of this set of data. Had this been, 6,000 or 2,000, then this doesn't add much more because you'd say, I've got 6,000, but outside I've got 800, where did these 6,000 come from? And then you can go do the investigation to find out. So sometimes this data is helpful, sometimes it's not. All right. Project F, I don't have a poll. I'm going to give you a moment to look at this. Well, I'm worried about time. So these are from operating rooms, OR, 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 outdoor sample. In this case, I would argue you don't need the outdoor sample. Operating rooms, what your concerns are totally different, and the consequences of fungal growth in an operating room is totally different. It can be fatal. So lung transplants, the rate of infections, nosocomial infections that occur with lung transplants is appallingly is a strong word. They do their best. It's disappointingly high. I have a paper, I'm going off memory, which always makes me scared, but it was like 20% or 30%. It was a high percentage of lung transplants recipients came down with these invasive fungal infections, and the consequences of that were not good. Their lifespan was shorter, and sometimes it was just fatal really quickly out of the blocks, and in all cases, or the vast majority, their lifespan was shorter compared to the rest of the group. So, and in that case, you're worried about Aspergillus fumigatus, there it is, that's the one, and some others that are some species of mucor, there's a handful of these that are particularly invasive. And in that case, one is too much, right? It just takes one to get hold. Now, will all of them? No, right? But could one? Yeah. And the consequences are bad? Yeah. So this is not good air to have in these operating rooms. And you'll notice this is the conversion factor. We got 1, and that's 1 per cubic meter. That's because we took 1,000 liters of air. So I'm short on time. But the message here is if you're dealing with an operating room, it's a totally different ballgame, and call us or talk with some expert, because how you take the samples, the sample volumes, the sample types, the analytical types, the data interpretation is different. And so just deal with it differently. Okay. We are done. Okay. So for CEUs, again, after this is done, you'll get a thank you email, take the survey within 24 hours, and 2 to 3 weeks later, get your certificate. Thank you for joining us. I will answer some questions here with the last few minutes, and then if there are questions that you'd like to ask me, just send it to me at dgallup, DGALLUP, at EMLab, EMLAB, and I will do my best to respond to them. All right. Questions? Okay, do I have a reference for settling rates of spores? I do have a paper. So if you want that reference for the settling rates of spores, send me an email and I will send you the reference, the paper that they studied that. Okay, there's one here. At an appropriate time, can I speak to the fungi curvularia? We have a fungal glossary on our website. So you just go to emlab.com, EMLAB.com. And if you look on the left-hand side, we have a shortcut link to the fungal glossary. That fungal glossary will list about 150-ish fungi. 40 of them, including, I think, curvularia, will have very detailed information about, we'll have useful information about curvularia, including can you find it by spore trap, by culture, or by tape width, a surface sample? What is known about its any toxicity, allergenicity or pathogenicity, and where you might find it. Does it grow in buildings? Where does it grow? And are there any helpful uses that we currently know about it? So there's about 40 of the fungi where we have that level of information. The others will have a paragraph that summarizes what is known, because the world doesn't know a lot about the fungi. And so sometimes all the world knows is like, oh, it's round and brown and it has these appendages and blah, blah, blah. But that's a very good resource. Okay, on the Alaska poll, Alaska or any other cold weather location, I look for firewood outside. Wood sits for a year outside, time to dry and season. Don't focus solely on the one item, though. Ensure it's not masking an issue. Oh, that's a very good comment. Yeah, maybe the source of the, so it could be like a false positive we discussed earlier, that yes, there was mold growth and it was an agent of wood decay, but it was coming from a benign source, if you will. All right, we're at the hour. Thank you all for your time. I realize there are questions here I didn't get to. Just please, I typed one last fall. Yes, we should fix that. Send me an email, and I hope you found this helpful. Thanks. Marvin, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. And as Dave mentioned, as a reminder, to receive a certificate of attendance, you'll need to complete the post-event survey. We'll post the survey at the very end of this session as we conclude. We'll also send that same survey in a thank you email. Just make sure you complete the survey within 24 hours to qualify for a certificate of attendance. And again, as I mentioned at the start of the session, the survey is the same that we post at the very end as well as in the email. So if you finish the survey at the end of the session, no need to complete it again when you get that thank you email. We just send it out twice. Further questions about PDF certifications or CEUs can be emailed to webinars@emlabpk.com. And again, content-related questions can go to Dave at dgallup@emlabpk.com. This webinar has now concluded, and you may now disconnect. Have a great day, everyone.